Welcome to this webinar with our speaker, Anita Nowak, today. My name is Erin Mullins, and I'm the Alumni Officer for Students and Young Alumni in the Office of University Advancement at Concordia. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that Concordia's campuses are located on unceded Indigenous lands. The Gun Neoge Haga Nation is recognized as the custodians of the lands and waters in which we gather today. Tiohtià:ke, or Montreal, is historically known as a gathering place for many First Nations. Today, it is home to a diverse population of Indigenous and other peoples. We respect the continued connections with the past, present, and future in our ongoing relationships with Indigenous and other peoples within the Montreal community. Today, Anita will give a formal presentation and will then take questions from you. It will also be an interactive webinar. We'll be using the breakout function to encourage conversation following the question portion. I'll be moderating the chat box, so please feel free to type in your questions and comments for Anita, and she'll be very happy to answer them for you. And now a little bit about our speaker today. Anita Nowak is a proud Concordia alumna, a PhD, an empathy expert, and award-winning educator at McGill University. She's a sought-after speaker whose TEDx talks have attracted 85,000 plus views, and her first book, Purposeful Empathy, will be published in 2021. Anita is a fellow with the International Women's Forum and a certified coach who advises wealthy families to wield their philanthropy for social impact and advises C-suite executives about empathy. Anita will now begin her presentation.
Thank you so much, Erin, for that very warm welcome. And I want to thank everyone who's joined the call today. There's many things you could be doing today, and we're spending an hour together, and I am really delighted. I'm also really delighted as a Concordia grad to know that the university is inviting conversations of this nature with its alumni. I find that it says a lot about my alma mater that you see this as important as well. So I'm going to share my screen, and we're off to the races. Whoops, no. Wrong opening slide. There we go. So I'm going to set the stage with some opening slides, and I'm going to ask two questions to crowdsource some responses. And then, because the word empathy means different things to different people, I'm going to cover 5 things that I think you should know about empathy. And along the way, I'll share a couple of anecdotes. Midway, as Erin mentioned, I'll open up to a Q&A period. So as I go along through my presentation, please feel free to pop a question into the chat box, and Erin will curate those questions. After my formal presentation, we're going to use the breakout group function, so you'll have a chance to engage with the material, in particular in response to a question that I'll pose. And finally, we'll come back to the plenary. I'll invite the groups to share some highlights from their discussion. So hopefully that sounds good to everybody. I thought we would start today by taking a minute to center and find an opportunity to be really fully present. So in the first instance, you may want to close off all of the distractions that are on your computer, your phone. And if you want to just settle into a comfortable position, you may want to put your feet flat on the ground. You may want to, sort of feel your body lengthening upwards so that you're in a comfortable position. And you may want to take a couple of deep breaths. Don't know what you've been doing before this call, but if you want to let whatever was on your mind go so that you can be present, that would be terrific. So in the chat box, before we get going, I'd love for you to just name a product or a service or an institution, anything that was created by humans or something that humans have accomplished that speaks to our creativity, ingenuity, intelligence, capacities, etc. So just pop into the dialog box something that you think humans should be proud of, that we've done well. And I'm just gonna look quickly at the chat box as it's getting populated. Oh, music, flying, yes. The internet, vaccinations, yeah, fabulous, fabulous. Okay, so what I want to do, sandboxes, I love it. The printing press, indeed. So I'm going to share a couple of things that I think are pretty fabulous about human beings. So first, I think it's quite fascinating that we have developed cities. Now think about the extraordinary coordination and collaboration and creativity that has to happen behind the scenes for cities to function properly. The world, over 55% of the world's population lives in an urban center, and they're expecting by 2030 that there'll be at least 700 cities with over 1 million people, and there'll be at least 40 mega cities with 10 million people or more. I mean, it's fascinating. I don't know. We've also created the Olympics and all sorts of competitive sports to bring out like the physical capacities that we have and challenge ourselves in the most exciting ways that you can imagine. We've also, thanks to a collaborative research project internationally back in 2003, scientists mapped out our entire genetic makeup, which is amazing. We've sent people to the moon and into outer space. We're really thinking about going to Mars. We have created the United Nations to bring over 190 nations together to work on global problems and resolve conflicts. I think, you know, the aspiration of the United Nations is quite remarkable. And we are developing the science for artificial intelligence and robotics and everything that falls under the rubric of Industry 4.0. So we're really quite awesome as human beings. At the same time, I feel like there's a lot that is work that is underwhelming. So for example, there are many people on the planet that live in luxury homes, where the vast majority of people on the planet do not. Oxfam's latest Time to Care report states that global wealth inequality is completely out of control. This year, this spring actually, they reported that the world's 2,153 billionaires have more wealth than the 4.6 billion people who make up 60% of the planet's population. The 22 richest men in the world have more wealth than all of the women on the African continent. And women and girls put in 12.5 billion hours of unpaid care work each and every day, a contribution to the global economy of $10 trillion a year, more than 3 times the size of the global tech industry. And of course, it's not just in the global south that we see great disparities. Even in some of the wealthiest nations on the planet, we are seeing an increase in homelessness. Even in Canada, it's estimated that there are 35,000 who experience homelessness on any given night, and at least 235,000 Canadians are homeless in any given year. And thanks to COVID, we're seeing tent cities pop up across the nation, highlighting our homeless crisis. And some 75% of those people have mental health or addiction issues. 1 billion people lack access to safe drinking water. Over 1 billion people practice open defecation with major global health implications. It's estimated by the International Labor Organization that 27 million people around the world are being held in some form of bonded labor or being trafficked by the international sex trafficking industry. And of course, for the last decade or more, rates of depression, anxiety, self-harm, suicide, and addiction have all gone up, especially among youth. And it's worth mentioning that these are just a few data points. I haven't even addressed the social ills of systemic racism or the impact specifically of COVID lately. So I just say that we are incredible human beings that have accomplished a lot, and yet there's just a lot of trouble on the planet, including, of course, what we're doing to pollute our airs and the wreckage in terms of how we're devastating our natural ecosystems and biodiversity and polluting our waters. It's estimated that 8 million pieces of plastic make their way into our oceans every day. So this is all partly, or not all, but a lot of what we have seen is in support of more of this, right? Consumption. And I find that problematic. And what is the outcome of all of this? We're seeing massive climate change. So we're seeing flooding and fires in California. And who is impacted the most? People who have done the least to contribute to the climate change and who have the least capacity to mitigate its impacts. So you're seeing people who are addressing floods and droughts and hurricanes and typhoons. So the question I want to ask is, what does this suggest? So I'd like you to take a minute and populate the chat box with any idea that surfaces for you in terms of what does all of this suggest? I'm seeing comments like, we're nuts, this is imbalance, we've lost our connection, humans are greedy, we're self-centered, there's not enough support for those in need, selfish, we need to be doing so much more, we aren't as evolved as we'd like to think we are. These are beautiful comments, and I appreciate your engagement. And I'll ask that you also consider what might be the remedy. So what might be the remedy at a personal level, at a community level, at a global level? Yes, empathy, I'm seeing empathy. Certainly self-awareness, presence, choosing a passion, taking action, caring for others. Absolutely. Volunteer work. Thank you so much. So what I want to suggest is that what I've shared speaks to two things. One is that the system itself is flawed or broken or sustainable or unjust, whatever words you want to use to describe it. Something's gone wrong at the very meta level. And some people will say that humans are indeed flawed and greedy, and some of the worst instincts that we have are being showcased under these circumstances. So I want to debunk a little bit that we are naturally and inherently flawed by talking about our cousins, the chimpanzees and the apes, or rather the chimpanzees and the bonobos. So this is a chimpanzee and this is a bonobo. And what's interesting, I was very struck by this data that I discovered in some of my research, is that we as human beings share more in common with chimpanzees and more in common with bonobos in terms of our DNA makeup than they share with each other. Now, Frans de Waal, who's a primatologist out of the Netherlands, has said that we have spent the last 50 or so years studying chimpanzees to understand human nature. And as a result of that, we've come to the conclusion that we are hierarchical by nature, violent by nature, that we are prone to violence. And he says if we had studied the bonobos instead, we would have a different conception of what it means to be human, because bonobos by very nature are compassionate and collaborative by nature. They take care of themselves the way that we recognize as humans that we take care of one another as well. So on the first pass, I want to say that we do have some instincts that are maybe greedy and that are maybe competitive, but I believe that the social paradigm that we're living in and the meta story that we are being told through most of the stories that circulate in our culture is the chimpanzee version of who we are, as opposed to the deeply compassionate, deeply collaborative people, human nature that we have. So I do believe that one of the remedies is more empathy in the world, and that's what I want to talk about today. So first, let's debunk, or let's get on the same page about what empathy really means. And I have 5 things that I want to cover. So oftentimes I'll ask, what is empathy? And people have a different set of ideas about what empathy looks like and how it manifests. So as you look at these images, I ask you to think about, is this empathy showing itself? Is this empathy showing itself? Most times when we do when I get feedback, people will say empathy is stepping into someone else's shoes, and I wouldn't disagree. Some people will say empathy is seeing through other people's eyes. I wouldn't disagree. Some people would say empathy is feeling what someone else is feeling. Again, these are all great interpretations of what empathy means. But what I'd like to do is share sort of my definition of empathy and some really key attributes to empathy. So in the first instance, my working definition is that empathy is the innate trait that unites us in our shared humanity, with a very important caveat that it doesn't mean denying or discounting lived experience, because we all have different lives, but we share a common humanity. So when I was doing my research initially on empathy 10 years ago for my PhD, there were a lot of words that were treated as synonyms in the literature and often conflated, but they really do mean different things. They have different etymological roots, but also even in today's vernacular, they mean different things. So I want to just cover this continuum. On one side is pity, followed by some sympathy, compassion, and empathy. And on the pity side of this continuum, there is a power differential that's embedded in the relationship. When you pity someone, you necessarily look down on them. Oh, you poor person. And a lot of foreign aid and a lot of philanthropy is predicated on a rather paternalistic pity paradigm. But as you make your way across the continuum to empathy, there is a recognition that we share a common humanity. Despite all the lived experiences, we share this common humanity. The second thing that I wanted to share is that the empathy actually has two characteristics. One is cognitive empathy, which is perspective taking. It is the capacity for you to think about how someone else might be feeling or what they might be experiencing given a certain circumstance. So as somebody is telling you a story and you're listening, you're engaged in your cognitive empathy capacity as you're trying to discern what that story might feel like or how that story might be playing out in someone else's lives. And we have experience of cognitive empathy through any good fiction as you get into the lives of characters and you imagine what they're going through. On the other hand, there is affective empathy, which is very much to do with the heart. And that is a spontaneous response that happens naturally. And you don't have to even think twice. You come across a stimulus and your brain triggers an emotional response to that stimulus. So I'll let you experience that with this little simple example. So here's a picture. I don't know why it keeps clicking. Apologies for that sound. A picture of this radiant child who is smiling ear to ear. And if I were to look at all of you on the call and I were to see your faces, your face would soften and you would have a tendency, if not a full-blown smile, that your face would be more relaxed and you would be edging towards a smile. Your brain does that naturally. Now watch what happens to your face. Your face will change its composition and you'll feel differently in your body when you look at this picture. And that happens completely naturally thanks to your affective, emotional, affective empathy response and the mirror neuron system that underpins that. So we've talked about the altruism continuum and we've talked about cognitive and affective empathy. The third thing I want to share is that we are all born with the innate capacity to empathize. All neurotypical people are born with the innate capacity to empathize. There are a few outliers. We won't go into the rabbit holes, but psychopaths is an outlier, and to a certain extent, people who are on the autism spectrum are neurally atypical. But if you're a neurotypical person, you're born with the capacity to empathize, and it develops through your childhood and over a lifetime based on the experiences you've had. And there are particular benchmarks that you make through your own development as a person to increase your capacity to empathize. And you can continue to grow your capacity to empathize throughout life. One story that I like to share is there's a particular moment that happens at the 3-month mark in a child's development. And as a new mom, I remember going out for a walk with my daughter, and it wasn't top of mind, to be very honest with you, but we were out for a walk late in the summer, and she was in her stroller, she was fully awake, and we passed another mom with a baby in another stroller, and we just sort of, we're ships passing through the path, and that child was having a cry fest for whatever reason. And I remember the moment when my daughter became conscious of the other child, saw the other kid crying, and burst spontaneously into crying herself. And I was like, yeah, right on target, right on time. That compassion, it's called empathy contagion or emotional contagion, right on cue at about the 3-month mark. The fourth thing that I want to share about empathy is that we can become more empathic with practice, and that's very much related to our neuroplasticity. So just like you go to the gym and you do bicep curls to bulk up your biceps and your muscle gets stronger, you can do the same thing with empathy. You can practice being empathic and therefore become more empathic through the practice. And that has to do with the way our has to do with our neural connections and how they're developed and how they're strengthened as a result of experiences that get repeated. I remember when I came across the literature about neuroplasticity and how it relates to empathy and this idea of practicing empathy, I had a very interesting experience. It was the holiday season. I was at Place Ville Marie in the lineup, a really long lineup. And this is, before mobile phones could distract us and we wouldn't notice the time passing as much. I must have been in lineup at a FedEx for about 30 minutes. And I was just in a really kind of rotten mood. And so was everybody in the lineup, and got to the customer care person, a woman, and she was just nasty. She was just very, very nasty. And she just greeted me very impolitely. And of course, as the customer, I could have sort of one-up that. But based on this literature about practicing empathy, I decided to do an experiment. So I looked at her and sunk into a place of genuine concern and said, "Are you okay?" And in that little pregnant pause, the two of us looked at each other like human beings, and she burst into tears. And she told me that she's been working double shifts for nearly 2 weeks. Her child at home is sick. She's also sick. She hasn't had lunch. It's 3 o'clock. She's exhausted. And just that little bit of humanity showed up. She thanked me and then continued to serve me with nothing but grace. And I just remember walking away, ended up getting a little tea from the food court, just feeling so connected to her. And so there's all sorts of ways all day long throughout our lives where we can just practice empathy and become more empathic. So I wanted to take this moment now to ask, before we go to the fifth aspect that I wanted to share, and then the breakouts, are there any questions? So Erin, do you see any questions that you'd like to ask on behalf of people who have been listening?
Well, Anita, this is fantastic. Prior to the presentation, we had a lot of questions that did come in. So I'm just going to pull them up here. And Monique asks, how do you get out of your reactive brain to be able to activate empathy in the face of a highly aggressive person?
Yeah, that's tough. We all still struggle with it. I still struggle with it. The first step is to become conscious that you have been triggered and you are now in your fight and flight mode. And the idea is to actually try to get back to a parasympathetic space where your breathing is more controlled and your cortisol is not racing, so that you're not being reactive, that your body is not leading the charge, but that you are simmering down so that you can actually speak in a more calm and collected way. And this takes practice. And so one of the ways to get there, and this is not something that you can practice and 4 hours later you become better at it. This is sort of like work in progress for a lifetime, is to actually do a sort of meta meditation. So for 10 minutes, you can practice this on your own time, where you begin, let's say in the first 2 minutes or so of the meditation, just sitting down calmly, reflecting on people that you love, where it's easy to send them loving joy, compassion, empathy, thinking about what their lives are like and just wishing the best for them. So you do that for a couple of minutes. And then 2 minutes later, you start thinking about people you like, people that are friends, people that you haven't seen in a while, that again, it's really easy to send them kindness. Then in the third set of minutes, you'll send them to random people you've never met. So imagine the farmer that cut the wheat that went into your bread this morning, or think of somebody that you'll never meet on the other side of the world, who might be a fisherman or somebody working in a factory, and you send them loving kindness. And then the final step of that meditation would be to actually intentionally choose somebody who has upset you, either in your personal life or somebody that, you know, theoretically is on the other side of an equation from you, politically or otherwise, and you send them kindness. And through that practice, you will develop the capacity to modulate when you get into that charged, triggered state.
Fantastic, thank you. Corrine asks here, is it harder for adults to develop more empathy as they age?
Is it harder for adults to engage in more empathy as they age? Well, so as I mentioned, brain plasticity means that over time, based on experiences that we've had and even thoughts that we've had repeated over a lifetime, our neural connections become more and more entrenched and more automatic. So over time, we become sort of a little bit more solid in how we view the world, how we react to things. That doesn't mean that it actually precludes the capacity to empathize. It just means that we have to work a little bit harder to actually engage with empathy. So if you're having a reaction, I remember having a conversation with my mom in a car some years ago, and there was a squeegee kid that came by, and she made a comment about them, and I did a little bit of education with my mom about what it means to be a homeless kid on the street and what that typically means for the kid's life, and that they're not out being lazy bums on the street as she may have assumed. And so you want to challenge the thinking that you have, and intentionally imagine how somebody else might be experiencing something. So there is an opportunity, even as you age, to question your assumptions, but it requires a little bit more mindfulness and thought.
Hey, wonderful. Megan asked an interesting question. She says, are there limits to empathy? And if so, how do we navigate those barriers?
Yeah, that's a question I often get, and there are definitely some limits to empathy. The first being what's known as compassion fatigue, or secondary trauma. People who are in the caring professions, right? Nurses in particular, to a large extent, teachers as well, especially in this COVID circumstances, are providing care. That's their job. Social workers, the same thing. And it's very common that they get burned out, not only from the stresses of their work, but also from the sense of compassion fatigue. So it's really, really important for people who want to stay empathic, but don't want to kind of cross over the line where it becomes at risk to your own well-being. It's very important to do a little bit of self-regeneration and plug in your battery to make sure you recharge so that you feel ready to empathize again, so your battery's not running on low. There are other things as well. There's something called psychological discounting, which makes us less concerned about our future selves and the lives that are remote from us. Some people also talk about othering from, like known entities, like people that are like you, your friends, your family, your community, like people. So there are some inherent biases and limits there. There's also something called psychic numbing, which makes it difficult to empathize with the larger the number. So, when you think about calamities that are happening due to natural disasters, it's really hard to empathize with 17,000 people being impacted by a hurricane or something like that. So there are limits definitely to empathy.
Ivana asks here, what strategies do you think work best with teenagers in a high school setting, whether in the classroom, through extracurricular activities, or service learning?
Yeah, so I think I've just been exposed to an online video game. I wrote about it in a recent blog because I think the first and only video game I've ever played in my life was back in the 80s, Tetris. And I was exposed to another video game called Real Lives. So you can Google that. It's a simulator where you're born into a life, and you can be born into life randomly, or you can choose which country on the planet you want to be born into, what gender, and there's a couple of other parameters. And it's an amazing game because behind the scenes, there's over 100 data sets from the United Nations, Amnesty International, children, different organizations that have real statistics on what's going on with the world population. And all of those data sets are put into the simulator so that when you're born into a life, you are born into a potential life based on the statistics. And you go through life, and for the first 8 years, things happen to you. And then after those 8 years, you start to make decisions. And I was really stunned. I was born into a boy's life in India, and before I turned 8 and started making decisions for myself, I had died from malnutrition. And I played it a number of times, and I experienced an 82-year-old life having been born in Sweden. And it's an amazing game for any young person to actually grapple with the realities of humanity around the world. So that would be like a real specific example. Another example for a younger age group would be the work of Roots of Empathy that bring babies into classrooms and provide opportunities once a month for children to actually talk about the child's development, the baby's development month over month, and they develop like what the founders called emotional literacy, so the capacity to express feelings. There are a lot of different tools that are available now to sort of work our empathy muscles at school. And I'm more than happy to share a set of resources after this webinar. Did that fully answer the question? Was it about school?
Yes.
Yeah, I covered the ground. Yeah, there are a lot of really great resources that are out there. But the important thing is to actually to not just do a one-off. To bring this idea of sort of building our empathy muscles as something like I've heard it said that there's STEM, science, technology, engineering, math education for the 21st century, and others are calling for esteem, and the extra E is around empathy and ecology. So learning to think with a mindset of sustainability and empathy. So I would encourage anybody to look up esteem pedagogy.
Fantastic, thank you. Jonathan asks an interesting question. He says, those on social media seem to regularly practice the opposite of empathy. Why does it seem like everyone is so combative on nowadays?
Yeah, it's a great question, and there's a lot to unpack there. I think the top answer is that a lot of the discourse of social media is anonymous. So you can hide behind your anonymity and say mean things. Also, there's research that shows that when you're in the social media arena, that you don't really think about the impact that your comment has on the person saying it. You just are blowing off steam. So there's a lot of research that looks at the toxic space of social media. And I, for one, have grappled with wanting to go more public in terms of my own work, because I just don't want to deal with the hate. So I completely understand, why there's reticence to engage. But it really comes down to those two primary things. And I would encourage anybody to watch The Social Dilemma. if you want to learn more about sort of the dysfunctions of social media permeating our lives and the risks that are coming with online social media.
Fantastic. Okay. Natalia asks here, how can empathy be implemented into journalistic stories? And where is the line between empathy and objectivity?
Great question. Yeah, so there's a lot of work in virtual reality that's looking at this question, right? Because you want people to feel what others are experiencing. So some virtual reality films, take you to refugee camps, for example, or to places post natural disaster, so you can feel what it's like to be in those circumstances. And then there's a critique around how that could be disaster tourism, and that there is an objectifying of people's lived experiences. So in terms of storytelling, I think we know that the story of one person will be more powerful than sort of a theoretical about stats. So I still believe that there is power behind the story, and storytelling has existed since we've been able to communicate as a powerful tool to evoke an emotional response. But there is an important balance to be struck. We can all remember certain advertisements back in the 80s that was raising money for international aid that showed children emaciated with these unfortunate kind of framing that doesn't really value and honor the person that's being represented. So I think it's a matter of striking a balance. I think what I might do, unless there's a burning question, I might move out of the question and Q&A, and we're going to move to the next aspect. But of course, I'm still around to answer more questions later if there's time. Is that okay? All right. So the fifth thing that I wanted to share is that empathy is wonderful, but I don't believe it's enough. We need purposeful empathy at scale. And I want to share sort of the main characteristics of what I'm calling purposeful empathy. And that is that it leverages our cognitive empathy, so our capacity to think. So this is not about the natural capacity to empathize, but our capacity to imagine what someone else is experiencing. I've already talked about that. It recognizes our shared humanity without discounting lived experience. But what I want to go into now is that it is political by nature, it is spiritual by nature, and it elevates joy, purpose, and well-being in our life. So in the first instance, it is political by nature because it challenges the status quo and calls for collective action. So I want you to think about all of the social movements that have happened where more people have had access to more rights. So whether it was the suffragette movement or the SALT marches or the civil rights marches or the anti-apartheid movement or the LGBTQ movement or March for Our Lives or the Women's March in 2017 or the climate strikes that are happening or the Black Lives Matter marches that are happening, all of them require engagement of us as a citizenry. And it requires us to step out of our comfort zones. It requires us to challenge the status quo. It requires that we may not all experience the impacts of different circumstances, but we can empathize with those who do. And I think it's quite interesting. I'm going to find a set of notes that I actually took down for today. I did a little research on the word political, and it actually comes from the Greek word polis, which means city or state. And to be political is to be actively engaged as a citizen, including debating with other citizens, exercising the right to vote, fulfilling civic responsibilities, including jury duty or military service, and paying taxes. But as an aside, I discovered that it's interesting that the word used by ancient Greeks to describe a person who does not participate in the affairs of the polis was an idiot. That's the word, the origin of the word idiot. And ancient Athenians also recognized that a democratic society can only survive as long as its members continue to participate in it. As soon as citizens begin to neglect their civic duties, democracy slowly begins to collapse into ruin and decadence. So to the ancient Athenians, nothing could be more reckless and irresponsible than neglecting one's civics duties. So I think purposeful empathy is political by nature. I also believe it is spiritual by nature. And by that, I mean, purposeful empathy allows us to celebrate oneness. And this is what I mean by that. I had a conversation not too long ago with a fabulous woman by the name of Elif Gokidem. She lives in DC now, but she's originally from Turkey, and she has a PhD in Islamic art. And I was interviewing her, asking her what about her research informed her thinking about empathy. She's written a couple of books about empathy, and this is the story that she shared with me that I'm happy to share with you. So here are two dots, and if you think about sort of the most fundamental geometric entity, it is the connection of those two dots with a line, okay? And if you have three dots and you connect them, you form a triangle. And if you have four dots, you form a rectangle. And there are many, many different shapes that don't have names where you could map out a bunch of dots and connect them all. And what's interesting about what she said is that there's the power behind the circle as a metaphor for empathy. And she said, no matter what shape you look at, doesn't matter any shape that you can think of, when you stretch out the shape to its maximum conclusion, you ultimately end up with a circle. And she said, what's powerful about the circle in terms of how it can inform our thinking about empathy is that the circle is made up of an infinite number of dots along its circumference. So think for a second about the 7 billion plus people on the planet that we're all, a dot on the circumference of the circle. The extra layer to that is that even if we're side by side looking to the epicenter, we do not have the exact same perspective. And if you're further apart on the circumference, you have a different perspective. If you're on the opposite side, you might have the opposite perspective. So it speaks to this idea that we are all born with shared humanity, but we all have different lived experience based on where we're born and our life circumstances, our lived experience, and yet we are all equidistant to center. So if you want to view center as whatever gave you life, whatever frame you want to use for that, we all have different lived experiences, yet we're all equidistant to life source. And I find that extremely powerful metaphor for empathy, and it speaks to this oneness that we have as human beings. So I believe that empathy is both political by nature and spiritual by nature. And lastly, so here you go. Sorry, I meant to show this slide about 10 seconds ago. And finally, empathy is good for us. It releases feel-good hormones like serotonin, oxytocin, endorphins that activate the opioid receptors in our brains to reduce pain and boost pleasure. It also reduces stress and anxiety by decreasing cortisol, which is a stress hormone, and it prevents illness by lowering levels of inflammation that are associated with all sorts of health problems, including diabetes, cancer, chronic pain, obesity, and migraine. So engaging in an empathic embrace is also good for us as an organism, as a living organism. So now what I'd like to do is I'd like to invite you to participate in some breakout groups and maybe have a little conversation in response to this very open-ended question. So now what? Armed with all this information, now what? What can we do together? What comes up for you? And I think we have time to maybe do that for 10 minutes before we come back for the wrap up. So could I invite my colleagues at Concordia to set that up?
Yes, and we encourage you to accept the invitation And you'll be in there for about 10 minutes, and then we'll get back to the main room, as Anita mentioned.
For those who have just joined back to the plenary, I would really appreciate if you could include some comments in the chat box, maybe some interesting observations or thoughts, ideas in response to the conversation you had with your breakout group, ways that we can address the collective empathy deficit in our society. How can we engage in more purposeful empathy in our lives? So whatever strikes you. I'm just going to open the chat box and see how that's going. Is everybody back?
Yes. Are back, yeah.
Great, well, welcome back, everybody. I would really appreciate if you would take a minute to write in the chat box some insights, some observations, some ideas that came up in your conversation about how we can create a more empathic world, how we can leverage purposeful empathy in important ways. My next slide is actually going to speak to the fact that Concordia is willing to share the full transcripts of today's seminar, webinar, whatever word you want to call. So, and I would love to stay in touch with you. So whatever gets posted onto the chat box will be shared. So we'd love to hear some of your thoughts and reflections. On the slide that you,
go ahead,
Erin.
Do you want me to read through the comments, or would you like to just kind of scan through?
Oh, I'm seeing them pop in, so thanks. Yes, I'm seeing adding, so remain curious. We talked about self-empathy and being a self-starter, reading memoirs, having empathy for ourselves. I completely agree with that. What I have done is I've put up a slide that talks about sort of 6 things that I believe are crucial ways that purposeful empathy can actually move the needle, especially if they're adopted at scale. And I speak about them in my book, Purposeful Empathy. I'm going to take advantage of this moment before my closing remarks that if you want the entire transcript, and if you want to stay in touch with other people who are on the call, myself included, please put your email in the chat box and we will share the transcript and we will stay in touch. Of course, there are many ways you can stay in touch with me if you have questions. So, you know, here's my website, anitanowak.com. Feel free to pre-order the book. You can watch the trailer, but there's lots of other things that I do. I have a weekly blog, a monthly newsletter. I do weekly purposeful empathy interviews with people on YouTube. You can join our Facebook community. So please stay in touch in all these different ways. The final comment that I would like to just share is that research has proven that humans are born to empathize, and waves of collective empathy have been part of our successful evolution as a species, and being empathic is good for us. So that means we can wield empathy as our superpower to help humanity take an evolutionary step forward. And that, to me, is what purposeful empathy is all about. So thank you very much for joining. And I really appreciated this opportunity to share an hour with you today.
Well, thank you, Anita, for that wonderful presentation, and for all of you for taking the time out of your busy day to join us. We hope you enjoyed this web presentation and learned how important empathy is for us all. So if you have any comments, questions, and you want to keep in touch with Anita, please write your questions, comments in the chat box. Thank you, Anita, again for this fantastic presentation, and enjoy the rest of your day, everybody. We'll see you soon.
Let's keep the chat box open as people are still adding their email address, if you don't mind. And if somebody out there has a burning question, we still have officially 2 minutes. I'm happy to stick around. Are people able to unmute themselves on this call?
They are able to unmute themselves, yes.
Yeah, okay. So if anybody does have a burning question, feel free to unmute yourself.
I guess within the 90 seconds that are left, what can we do with that person who's at the FedEx desk who's really having a bad day, besides what you did?
I mean, if you don't actually engage with them, you give yourself permission to assume the best of them and that they're having a hard day. Otherwise, it is a matter of reaching out to them, you know, with an offer of humanity and just saying, are you okay? Giving space to people to show up with what they're experiencing allows them to sort of shift gears. They, you know, sometimes they might be defensive about it, but oftentimes you'll find that people, if it comes from a really genuine place and they can sense the sincerity, are so grateful for the opportunity to just sort of expunge some of the feeling that they're holding on to. And it's a real gift.
Yeah. And I'm the type of guy, even if the person yells at me, I'll go back and I tried. And the batting average is pretty good if you really try.
Agreed, Steve.
And those odd times where the person says, why did you open the door for me, you lousy chauvinist? I just think she's had a bad day.
Thank you so much for that comment, Steve. Appreciate that.
Very good.
Hi, Anita. Catherine McMorrow, just wanted to really thank you for this. And do you talk in your book about teaching children, or actually giving children the opportunity? I think more of that's being done in the schools to experience empathy and to practice it.
Yeah, there's an entire chapter devoted to empathy within education at elementary school, tertiary, and even at university level. So yeah.
Okay, thanks. And that
my background isn't, sorry.
Go ahead, go ahead.
I was just going to say my background is in the Faculty of Education. I'm in pedagogy, so I care a lot about teaching empathy. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
You were going to say?
Yeah, the video game, I've never played a video game. Once with my nephew, and he said my digital ability was hopeless. So I'm going to really check that out. That sounds wonderful.
Honestly, it's $20. I think it's the best holiday gift that you can pass along to a child in your life. I think any kid from 10 years old to 20 years old would come out of playing that game saying that they enjoyed it and learned a lot.
Yeah, but adults would too. I give
Yes.
retreats and seminars and stuff on this. So I would, show it and have people experience it. So thank you for that.
My pleasure.
Okay, well, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you again, Anita, and for everyone for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day. And we will send the recording out within the week.